Outa-space because artists lack the space to create. Outa-space because the street, the squares, and all the common places where we mix in are where we need to decide our future. Outa-space because we need to take our minds above the clouds to look down on our planet, to dream, to wonder, but also to see everything in the context of everything else. Hi, I am Robbie Bot, your in-flight guide. I hope you enjoy this episode on memory activism with Sebastiaan Faber. Welcome to Outa-space podcast, and today I'm joined by Sebastiaan Faber. Hi, Sebastiaan, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Thanks very much for coming. So today I'm going to talk to you about memory activism and about yourself and the work you do. So first of all, I'm just gonna say who I think you are, and then ask you to say no, that's not true. I've never done that. Or more importantly, to add some things that I don't know. So what I know about you is you were the chair of ALBA, the International Brigade Association in the United States. You're still on the board of that, which is a very important organization for historic memory in the International Brigades. You're a professor of Hispanic Studies at Oberlin University, or in Oberlin.
It's called Oberlin College.
Oberlin College. Okay, in Idaho, I can't say that properly, which is near Cleveland in the US. You're originally Dutch, but obviously you've been in the US a long time. You're an academic, and also you're a journalist. So that's what I know about you. I've had a little look on your website as well, so I know some of the great stuff you've written. You've written a lot. So that's who I think you are. Is that right? Is there other things about you that might be interesting?
No, I think you're right. So what I spend my time doing is thinking and teaching and writing about Spain primarily and Latin America, because that's my field of academic training. But as a journalist, I also cover U.S. politics and Dutch politics, and I'm combining. I'm not sure if fully legitimately, but I've been trying to combine an academic profile, a professor journalist, and or public intellectual with a kind of an memory activist profile. So the work for the Abraham Lincoln Parade Archives, which is the IB organization in the U.S., is educational, but also in a way advocacy work for the keeping alive the memory of the IB, much like the IBMT does in the UK.
Yeah, and people who listen to this podcast who know me quite well will know, obviously, I'm very much involved in those kind of things as well, with the building of Solidarity Park, and that we've come across each other over the last few years, and we met for the first time very recently, which was lovely. And I'm really pleased that you've decided to come on the show and have a quick chat with us. So, to start with, just tell us a little bit about ALBA, what that is, and why the International Brigades and that historic memory question is important from an American point of view, and then for, if you like, for a world sort of geopolitical point of view. What is it inspires you to be interested in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. ALBA was founded in the late 70s by a group of people that included veterans of the Spanish Civil War, academics, and activists. And the main goal at that point was to find a way to safeguard the documentary traces, the documentary archive of the volunteers' experience in Spain, which was first collected at Brandeis University in Boston and later, starting in 2000, at New York University in New York City. Since the gradual passing of the vets, younger generations have stepped in, and sort of asked themselves quite explicitly whether this work should continue after the vet's natural lifespan had expired, and what shape that should take. And we decided full-throatedly to do that and to focus on a combination of activism and education. So we do a fair amount of work with teachers. We also try to educate the general public. We have a quarterly magazine, The Volunteer, that continuously brings new research to people and tries to connect as much as we can the legacy of the historical anti-fascism that the veterans represent with current anti-fascist causes, among which we centrally focus on human rights causes. So, among other things, ALA awards an annual Human Rights Activism Award together with the Puffin Foundation in the to the tune of $100,000 that we started presenting in 2010, so we're about 15 years along, and that what that really tries to do, that award, is to underscore how individuals and organizations today, in a way, in our view, embody the legacy of the Lincoln vets. In our educational programs too, we try to really retell the story of U.S. history, to start with the anti-fascist activism prompted by the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and the outbreak of the war in Spain in 1936, to then sort of tell a different story of U.S. history that wonders why it took until December 1941 for the U.S. government to join a fight that some of its citizens had already joined 5 years earlier or 4 years earlier, and to then sort of shine a different light on U.S. history, and to focus both on the activities and victories of the veterans and everybody around them who rallied to the support of the Spanish Republic in the 30s, going forward into the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to shine a light on the resistance that they encountered, the surveillance they were subjected to, the harassment they were subjected to during the Cold War. So in our educational work, we tried to make space in a often very tight and busy curriculum for U.S. public schools to tell that story. And with the ultimate goal of inspiring kids, right, college students or high school or middle school students, to think of themselves as activists, to think of themselves as people who can intervene in the face of injustice, and who can gain some inspiration from people who've done that in this country in the past, whose stories might not normally have been included in their history lessons.
Yeah, because I mean, I think we're in a really interesting phase in the International Brigade stuff, because on the one hand, all the brigaders are died now, and their children are actually quite old in general, and so it's like it's a critical moment where there's still living memory, just, and when I say living memory, of the people themselves, as their family members are still conscious. So like, I know my dad very, very well, but I don't know my granddad that well, so my relationship with him, so that passing of history feels like it's a critical stage. And the other thing I noticed about Alba is that you do comment on other political issues, which is the International Brigade associations in other countries don't always do that, which I think is quite unique and quite interesting, because you're pushing, if you like, you're pushing the boundary a little bit. Would that be about right? Yeah, you'd agree that's...
Yes, yeah, we do, and you're right. That is a risky that carries some risk with it. And it doesn't always end well either.
Well,
But we do try. Like, for us, to even the selection of the award winner every year, right? That's a choice that we make,
yeah.
by which we like confess to a particular preference, or I mean, it's a really well designed process with a committee and a jury, and we don't do it overnight. We spend a lot of time thinking about it. But it is true that we really try to think of the anti-fascist cause as a cause that is alive, and the only way for us to do that is to connect it with current events. We have to also say that if maybe around the time that many vets were passing in the early 2000s, we could genuinely wonder whether educating the U.S. about anti-fascism was still useful or not. In the past 10 years, 10, 15 years, nobody would doubt that it's useful. So the fascism and anti-fascism have come back to public consciousness with such force that that where in the past we had to really explain to people why we think the work we do is relevant, now that's something we don't no longer have to do. Um, and that is sad in a way.
Yeah.
Uh, but it is also has given a kind of a new energy to our work. Like just an example, on Tuesday, is it 2 days ago, 3 days ago, I gave an all-day workshop for 30 or so high school teachers in New York City. And one of the texts, several of the texts we read there made people sort of like make a double take. Oh, wait a second. This was written in
Yeah.
19, there's a Henry Wallace text from 1944 about American fascism in the New York Times. And people are like, wait, this was written in 44? Really? Because this paragraph here could have been written today. So that kind of the return of history um, makes for really interesting discussions because, of course, the present never repeats the past. And there's all kinds of important differences. But those are exactly the kind of discussions that we hope to inspire in classrooms around the country, right? We don't want to prescribe anything. We ourselves are often not clear how the past relates to the present precisely. We just want people to think about it and talk about it with each other.
Yeah, I mean it's I mean like you say, it's obvious with Trump and Trumpism and what's going on in the US and how that's echoing around the world and how it's in many places, the growth of the far right internationally. The podcast that I'm doing, this series, has all been about the far right. Some people are saying to me, well, where's the art gone, Rob? And I'm saying, well, actually, the art of struggle is what this podcast has always been about. And so having a whole series on discussing the rise of the far right in different places, which your interview obviously is part of, is critical. So really interesting about the American side of it. What I'd like to pick your brains a bit about is what's actually happening right now, also in Spain, because it's a living process, the memory process, and there's been a change in the historical context, if you like, in Spain, hasn't there? Because when we talk about the brigaders all being dead, well, obviously none of the brigaders came from Spain because they went to Spain, but the actual historic memory battle in Spain is very sharp at the moment. Could you give us a little bit of an overall where that is at the present time or in the last number of years?
Yeah, sure. So the big picture is that, I mean, in a couple of days, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Franco's death.
Mm.
And you could say that those 50 years can be divided pretty neatly into two halves, where the first 25 years were dominated. I mean, they're not fully this, but they were dominantly um, colored by the notion that Spain would do best to let go of its past and to look to the future. In practice, that didn't mean that the war wasn't talked about or no movies were made about it. It just really meant that it was highly discouraged to connect Spain's political present to its past.
Mm.
So that the idea that you could explain contemporary politics as a function of either Francoism or the Civil War or the Second Republic, that was not encouraged. Then and what helped with that was the sort of the that famous binary of amnesia
Mm.
and amnesty that marked the Spanish transition. Right there, everybody was nobody could be prosecuted, and there was going to be not an emotional memory of the war that was going to be activated in the present. That started shifting around the year 2000, marked most prominently when by Emilio Silva's going to find the mass grave in which his grandfather had been buried after being summarily shot by right-wing paramilitary in Leon. And that set off what we now think of as the memory movement, the sort of like grassroots citizen organized series of different organizations that didn't always see eye to eye, but that shared the common goal of shifting that dominant view of the way that the past should relate to the present, to propose instead a much more emotionally and politically mediated relationship to the past, so that um, it became legitimate and encouraged to think of the causes in Spanish politics today, the progressive causes, let's say, of Spanish politics today, whether it's affordable housing or women's rights or immigration or and any kind of anything that could be broadly subsumed under progressivism or anti-fascism, could be connected emotionally and politically to the past. And that also meant finding a better way to honor the victims of the Franco regime, um, or the victims generally of right-wing violence starting in 1936, and to rethink the way that Spain as a nation tells the story of its past.
Mm.
So there's educational initiatives there. There are initiatives around the way that the past is present in public spaces, in monuments and plaques and street names and things like that, as well as ritualized commemorations, right, on the official holiday calendar. And so that those efforts really shifted that in my view managed to shift that dominant view, so that by now the idea that the past should be left in the past is much less prominent than it was in the years after Franco died.
Mm.
At the same time, these initiatives, which eventually led to two important memory laws in 2007 and 2022, have consistently met with the stubborn resistance and immovability of the Spanish right. The Spanish far right, which manifested itself in a political party form fairly recently in Vox, but also the Spanish center right, that the Partido Popular, which has consistently sort of dismissed this entire memory movement as either misguided and dangerous because opening up wounds from the past will only lead to trouble, or as opportunistically interested in state subsidies or in pushing agendas that were illegitimate. So in that sense, that's the for me the nature of the memory battle in Spain is how to relate to the past and how to deal with this refusal on the part of the Spanish right to acknowledge that Spain's relationship to its past has in fact changed. And it's all that resistance is all the more surprising in light of two things. One, in light of the general attitude of other center-right European political parties with whom the PP sits in the same faction in the European Parliament, like let's say the German CSU, let's say, who has never had trouble identifying itself as anti-fascist, right, and as democratic, whereas the Spanish PP would never call itself anti-fascist. That's just not part of its vocabulary. Um, and the second thing is that in those, well, since 2000, but since before that, since the 90s, worldwide, the views about what transitional justice looks like
Mm.
have changed, right? So the idea that after a period of dictatorship, it's good for the state to acknowledge the victims and to serve the victims, right? To serve the victims' needs that have been acknowledged and written down in United Nations conventions and in international law. Like, given all that, the stubborn resistance to acknowledge to that kind of acknowledgement from the Spanish center right is all the more surprising, and in a way sets the Spanish center right apart from its fellow parties in other European countries, which never ceases to surprise me.
Mm. I
But
mean,
but it explain
I find this really quite interesting because if you look at somewhere like South Africa, or you look at somewhere like Germany itself, you just mentioned it with the Holocaust and all these kind of thing. You get this idea of dealing with the past, at least in some way. It may not
yeah,
be ideal. I mean, I went to South Africa shortly after apartheid left, and I went to Robben Island, and I went around Robben Island, and it was led by a guy from Angola who had been jailed there. And Robben Island was interesting. The prison was interesting, but he was amazing,
yeah,
and I asked him quietly at the end. I went up to him and said, "Oh, thanks, comrade. That was great." And I said, "How do you do this? How do you talk about this?" He says, "I have to."
yeah,
So what I've what's interesting though, I mean, you're talking about the PP. When I've talked to people, they say, well, the fascists never went away and the transition never dealt with them. It's all brushed under the carpet. A bit simplistic, but
mm,
relatively true, I think. But I'm kind of interested in why that shift change. Is that because of greater shift changes within Spanish society? Obviously, Vox, because when there was a big growth of far right organizations in Europe before Spain was slow on that because PP existed, and they held that place. And when Vox came along, there seems to be a speeding up of the memory activism, if you like, or the memory fight. Is that right, or am I being a bit
Yeah.
superficial?
No, no, you're right. You're right. I think so. If the Pepe's attitude tended to be sort of like resistant more than anything else, I say it tended to be because in reality, if you think back to Aznar in the late 90s,
Mm.
it was actually before the memory movement started per se, it was his government that sort of shifted that attitude already by like Aznar famously lionized Pio Moa when he came, like this sort of popular quote unquote historian who started recycling Francoist views of Spanish history. The PP supported that in the 90s publicly. So in the sense, the PP already started the memory battles in the late 90s, you could say. But since the rise of Vox, what you see everywhere else in the West is that the far right makes a very effective use of um, of memory battles in its culture wars against the
Mm.
left, right? And culture wars are very tempting to get into for the left as well. But I agree with analysts that say that culture wars are almost always a losing battle for the left. Like
It's an
culture.
interesting one. Yeah, it's one I'm really thinking on heavily myself at the moment because, I mean, first of all, you talk about memory studies, memory laws, these things, but one of the specifics that we want to sort of touch on was this idea of memory activism. And when you mention the culture wars, immediately I'm thinking about the battles that are going on there. And I see what you're saying. I've heard other left-wing people say, "Oh, we shouldn't go down that line because we can never win these sort of arguments." But obviously, there's a lot to defend.
Mhm.
There's a lot going on, and the culture wars. Because I was thinking, oh yeah, memory activism, memory struggles, but actually, culture wars is a very big part of memory battles. I wonder. I mean, I read your article, your paper, I suppose, in the handbook on memory activism, which is a really interesting book in its own right because memory studies is a long field of study, but memory activism is relatively new in terms of being named. But this is a great big handbook full of different struggles of memory activism, and you write a very interesting piece on revisionism and memory struggles and the far right and the far left. Um, could you sort of outline a little bit about what is going on with memory
Yeah.
activism in terms of
Yeah,
left and
sure.
right?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge the editors of that great Routledge handbook, Yefat Goodman and Jenny Wustenberg, who did a great job bringing this together. And the idea of memory activism is relatively simple, right? It's like when when the story that a community tells itself about its past becomes the subject of dispute, for example, in culture wars, or becomes central to political battles, there are often um, individuals and organizations who seek to actively influence that narrative, right?
Mm,
So an example in the United States, the 1619 Project, a journalistic project that seeks to rewrite the master narrative of U.S. history,
mm,
starting with slavery, not with the founding fathers. Um, but so memory activists come in all colors and shapes, from the left and from the right. And the I think the Yifat Goodman, who wrote a monograph about memory activism in around Israel, is it's really like, it's a very interesting, it's a very useful and productive frame to look at how the past plays into political battles, the stories about the past. My contribution is a short essay to that handbook tried to compare um, left-wing memory activism and right-wing memory activism in Spain and the Netherlands. And my point there is that you see in both countries, you see that in recent years, that the past has become like the far right has jumped on that bandwagon and the
mm,
left has also. So let's say in the Dutch context, you get the far right party saying we should be able to celebrate our golden age when we conquered the world and discovered new territories and became rich out of that. But we also spread culture, right? Sort of kind of old-fashioned white men's
mm, mm,
burden view. Whereas the left has been engaged in trying to have the country come to terms with its role in the slave trade. right? And the exploitations that are going on, and rethinking museums and curricula and things like that. So in a way, you could see these both sides as coming to the space of historical memory with similar goals, just from different opposite ends. So there's five things that I say both of these forms of memory activism have in common. I say they are okay with turning the story of the past into a political battlefield. They politicize it purposely. They both, in that way, pit themselves against the established narrative which they associate with forms of authority, the teacher, but also established historians, state institutions, museums, government agencies. Both engage with the past emotionally, affectively, right, through senses of honor and debt and love and hate and camaraderie and national identity. Um, um, Both act like do their activism in activities, right? They come together, they celebrate, they sing, they build things, they create things. And both also are met with a response from the official agencies that is generally kind of dismissive. Like, oh, these activists, they're not real historians. They're skewing, they're partisan, they're opportunistic, they're subjective, and we are objective and have the authority, right? So I think that all that they have in common, but there's really an important difference between the left and the right. And here, my main point is that right-wing memory activism seeks to return to some kind of past, less the past as such than the way we used to think about the past. So what far right historic memory activism wants to go back to is the way that history was taught in the 1950s, when all we learned about was our heroes, and we could sing the national anthem and be proud to be British, or be proud to be Dutch, or be proud to be American, or proud to be Spanish. Whereas the left memory activism is much more unsettling. It seeks to give new communities a voice. It seeks to put marginalized voices at the center. It seeks to unsettle established national narratives often, right? So that's a very different kind of end goal than the far right has. But both of them, they share the challenge of how do you deal with the authority of established historians, right? How do you deal with set curricula that have been taught like that for a long time? How do you intervene in national museums and monuments and things like that? So it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously for me, it's a very critical one because I fall on the side of a left, memory activist, very much so, and a monument builder at that. I mean, in terms of Spanish, the Spanish side of the question, and also with Solidarity Park, which listeners know quite a lot about, and if they don't, there'll be something in the links where they can look it up. How do you think that plays out? Because obviously in Catalonia, where I am, I mean, when you talk about your five things, they all work for what I do, with the exception of, I don't have to fight in Catalonia against the academic establishment so much, and I get support in general. The structures of it I have to fight, and the focus is not them for what we do, but in Catalonia, it's different than other areas in Spain, because we were just talking earlier about the battle in Spain, and in some regions, something like Solidarity Park couldn't exist. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One thing about the Catalonia's specificity within Spain, and another thing about what I think makes Solidarity Park so special and interesting. So Catalonia, because Catalan national identity, especially after 75, but also during the dictatorship, was formed against Francoism, which repressed it. It's almost a substantial part of knowing yourself to be Catalan means being opposed to Francoism and whatever it stands for today. So therefore, any kind of memory work that connects with the legacy of the Spanish Republic, that connects with the fight against Francoism, that thinks of itself as anti-fascist, is very easy, does not enter into conflict with the dominant view of Catalan identity. How that plays out in practice, there's all kinds of contradictions. It's strange that the far Catalan right thinks of itself as progressive because, after all, it's Catalan. So there's all kinds of contradictions there. But what it does mean is that that initial battle against an established right-wing bloc is just not there in that same way. But what makes Solidarity Park interesting, I think, in some ways, memory activism can be a trap because it can be essentialist, it can be too emotional, it can be sort of set in its ways. But I think that what makes your project so interesting is that, first of all, it has nothing nationalist about it, right? It's not wedded to any kind of sense of national identity because, after all, it's about the international brigades. And that, in a way, you vaccinate yourself against the temptations of patriotism or of national being boxed into kind of a national project. And the other thing is that it's so open-ended, right? The entire idea of Solidarity Park is community engagement, and the people from the community who engage get to make the content every single time again. And that makes it so dynamic that the connection between the past and the present, which is what memory activism is about, you don't dictate that in any way. You just create a space for it. And I think that makes it like if you're creating a space for community engagement or for an activist relationship to the past is so empowering to the adolescents that you work with and to the people from different countries that you work with, that in a way, like your project is dynamic in and of itself, and that protects it from the traps that other memory projects might have.
Cool. Okay. Well, I mean, that's interesting just to listen from not from a podcasty point of view, but from a personal point of view. So we're running out of time. Probably my internet's going to go in about 2 minutes. So is there anything finally you think that we need to think about in terms of memory activism and fighting for the struggle for these memories and the contradictions and the culture wars? And this is there sort of any sort of sharp message you think that people should think about?
Well, I think, I mean, the open-endedness of your project, I think that open-endedness is very important to keep in mind. And for me, that's always connected with the idea that the battles for memory have to be fought by every new generation. I mean, nobody is born knowing the past. Everybody has to be taught it and learn about it. And that is that's beautiful about it. But sometimes I think that in Spain and other countries, the battles are presented as if they have an end to them, as if they're finite, as if at one point there's a victory. Yeah. And that's just not the case. There's never going to be a final narrative, and there's always going to be contradictions. And but there's always going to be new generations that have to come in, participate, and then end up taking charge.
Well, thank you very much, Sebastiaan. Great interview.
Welcome, Rob.
We're going to get you back. We're going to delve into this some point later on all the different things. Look forward to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed your journey today. Please drop a few coins into any struggle for solidarity you support when leaving. We give apologies to regular listeners that due to cutbacks, there is not a space station comment session in this episode. Remember, do not forget, memory is today.